Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Institute Chairman Michael Milken in conversation with founder and CEO of Citadel, Ken Griffin.
So, Ken, it looks like you brought your fan club here today, huh?
Always prepared, always prepared.
Well, it's April 30th, 2019, and we're here at the Global Conference in Los Angeles, and our theme of this year's conference is Driving Shared Prosperity. Tomorrow, on May 1st, we'll have sessions on the future of the free enterprise system and the status of the American dream. But maybe let's start here, because I know it's something you're passionate about. Why do younger generations seem to be losing faith in the free enterprise system? Ken, what does this mean for the future, and what should we do about it?
Well, you and I grew up in a different era where the Cold War was raging on. And there was a great debate in America about the strengths and weaknesses of socialism as compared to the economic freedom that we enjoy in our country. And we saw that question answered. We saw the fall of the USSR, the fall of Eastern Europe, and we realized that that form of economic system left people in poverty, in a world of little choice, in a world of scarce opportunity, and it was incredibly clear that our free market system created far better standards of living. I have a young son, and he's 11 now, and when Bernie Sanders was running against Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton back a few years ago, there was a photo of a stadium full of supporters. And all I said to him is, I said, this is an entire stadium of people who don't know history. And we're seeing that play out in the debate today. If you look across the world, if you look to Cambodia, you look to Cuba, if you look to Venezuela, very timely, the track record of socialism, which is not just an economic system, but ultimately a political system, is one of complete failure. In Venezuela over the last year, I believe the average person has lost roughly 24 pounds. They're dying of starvation. They're dying from not having enough food to put on the table. And if you go back to the 1950s, to put it in context, Venezuela was about as rich as America per capita. Coin toss.
Venezuela was rated AAA in the 1970s. And for every dollar that was loaned to Venezuela, $1.50 came out, even though you had 20 to 30% unemployment at that time. But I think, let's look what Margaret Thatcher had to say on the subject for a moment. Could we see that little short discussion with Margaret Thatcher?
Capitalism has a moral basis. The reason being, unless you have economic freedom, you will have no other freedom at all.
Yeah.
So the whole of the capitalist society is a moral basis. The basis is that the individual is here to develop his or her talents. He cannot do that without both political freedom and economic freedom. The only kind of society under which you can do that is a capitalist society. To be free, you have to be capitalist. Every free society in the world is a capitalist society.
So if you look at Ken, if you look at a recent poll of 3,000 people on what they think America's about and what is this American dream, it's interesting. In this recent poll, the #1 response was freedom. It wasn't personal wealth, it was freedom. The #2 response was be able to raise a family in freedom. And those are both over 80%. Only 16% of the people saw this as personal wealth. So we're here in the United States today, and how do you view the current business climate and the economy?
The current business climate across the country is strong. What we're seeing, though, is a divergence between the blue and red states that I don't think was anticipated over the course of the last tax reform. We're seeing the blue states continue to embrace ever-increasing amounts of regulation, ever more challenging tax policies, and a set of programs and decisions that are just financially unsustainable. And so I live in Chicago, which is one of the great cities in the world, and yet we've seen more college-educated people leave Cook County, which is where Chicago is, than any other county in the United States. And they're fleeing from corruption, a state that can't put its fiscal house in order, and with those two dynamics comes crime and comes a scarcity of opportunity. So for the country as a whole, we are in the longest recovery post-World War II. But within our country, we are really seeing a ever-increasing sharp division between the states that are pursuing policies that create opportunity, that educate children, that allow people to have great careers, and states that continue to embrace failed policies that result in corruption, in cronyism, and in crime that are devastating to cities like Chicago.
Well, I think these challenges that we see, the attempt in this effort with opportunity zones to create them, to encourage people to invest in different areas. Do you see that has the potential to change?
I give the members, and Washington's been a wash and gridlock. And I think what's important to see out of Washington is we start to embrace bold changes that are going to unleash opportunity in our country. So the opportunity zones are how do we bring capital and businesses into areas that have struggled economically. We need to bring that same passion to problem solving, to education, to criminal justice reform. We need to start to attack some of the real problems that are causing both the income inequality that people find frustrating in America and the sense that the ability to get ahead has become diminished.
So let's start with the housing market. You and I, over a very long period of time here, have discussed the fact that many of the great challenges and problems we've had in the last decades can be traced to an overinvestment in residential housing, to government lending to people that couldn't afford the house, to the government giving you a first-time buyer's credit from that standpoint, and to this idea that owning a home was the American dream, even though when we look at the list of how people define it today, and particularly young people, they don't define owning a home as the American dream. And two of the strongest financial countries in the world, Switzerland or Germany, have low home ownership. We're talking about restructuring Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and maybe the weak link that's not those is FHA that continues to make very aggressive loans from that standpoint. Do you have any insight here? If we look back over time, there was a period of time that the government touched a very small percentage of loans and was a small part of the market. Now maybe 90% of all loans in some way touch the government. Do you have any insight as to what you think the best plan would be for restructuring Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac?
Well, I think that in the slides that came up, some of your strongly held beliefs come true, which is that the scale of the housing subsidy has caused a misallocation of resources in our society. I'm actually going to go to a bigger picture point. Where we see the government involved in great degrees of subsidization is where we often see our economy break down the greatest. So obviously in the housing market, we've had, with the advent of Fannie and Freddie, a huge amount of credit creation within the home ownership community. That fueled the great financial crisis of 2008. That was the epicenter of what went wrong in our economy. But if you look at student loan lending, which the US government effectively nationalized during the great financial crisis, you're now looking at the consequences of this 11 years later. You're looking at the cost of college education exploding exploding since the government has become involved. And you're looking at a generation of students who are now graduates who are completely disillusioned with their economic prospects given the huge amount of debt they've been saddled with courtesy of the US government, combined with the extraordinary high cost of education that they've paid courtesy of the US government. So I think it's interesting that if you look at both the housing market and the student loan market, there's this very common thread that when the US government gets into the business of subsidies, we create economic distortions that can have very profound and negative impacts.
So Ken, you've just cited, don't hesitate to clap, it's okay. You've cited the two things we've found in surveys of people 30 and under. How do they feel about the financial system? Is it working for them? Answer, no. Citing two. One, student loans, not working for them and the potential burden that has left them for the rest of their life, and even if they go bankrupt, they can't get rid of them. And two, they remember when someone tried to seize their house or their resident or their parents, or the embarrassment of not being able to paint their house or grow grass or whatever it might occur and being house poor. I would say probably the greatest side effect of that, of the crisis of both the mid-'80s and the oil states where the price of homes, say in Houston, went down 50%, has been looking at the utility curve of the middle class in America, where 50% of the money in the middle class in America is spent on their house or transportation. And if you look at Asia, that's about 15 to 16% in 11 Asian countries. Only 2% is an area that you have really been focused on, education, whereas the second highest expenditure in 11 Asian countries is education. So I think your analysis is where we've created these systems. I know when I went to Berkeley in '64, it cost $200 a year. If I adjusted for inflation, it'd be $500. But today, an in-state student pays $14,000. What did it cost when you went off to undergrad? Do you remember?
I want to say it was ballpark $40,000. But let's go back 3 slides. So let's take a step back for just a moment and talk about the millennials' embrace of the concept of socialism. These are 2 of the areas where the government has been most involved in our day-to-day life. Student loans over the last 10 years, and then of course the housing market through Fannie and Freddie over the course of the last several decades. And of course the banking system is backstopped effectively by the full faith and credit of the US government. Imagine that we take our experiences where the government has been so active, here in student loan financing, here in mortgage financing, here in the banking system, and extrapolate that across the rest of the economy. In fact, we tried just that with Obamacare. Remember Obamacare? You promised you'd keep your doctor, your cost of health care would go down, your ability to deal with the complexity of health care would be reduced. That's the last other big experiment with bigger government, and that has clearly failed millions of Americans as we've lost our doctors, we've lost ready access to health care. I think it's very important to understand that the free market is, of course, not perfect, but it is extremely good at delivering solutions and products that make people's lives better.
Now, Ken, you sound a little bit like Winston Churchill there. You know, Winston's famous quote was, "Capitalism creates enormous opportunities and creates disparity in income," I'm paraphrasing, "whereas socialism spreads equal misery to everyone." So,
but I would use a different choice of words. It's not capitalism that we value as Americans, it's economic freedom. You know, I grew up in a country where I could start a business in my college dorm room. And today, that business, a bit transformed, employs 2,500 people. I've been very fortunate to have been able to surround myself with individuals from all walks of life as my partners. My COO is in the front row. He is the son of a Chicago police officer. One of my colleagues grew up in mainland China. He's an immigrant to America. He's had a dramatic impact on the US financial markets. So I've seen the American dream work out, and I've seen the consequences of economic freedom play out for all of my colleagues at Citadel, who have been very fortunate in life to be part of a team that really knows how to work well together. So I think that we need to understand, when we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about a finite concept. What we really should focus on as Americans is economic freedom. The freedom to pick a career, the freedom to pursue a dream, the freedom to buy the products you want to buy, and the freedom to have the career you want to have in the location you want to live. These don't go with socialism. These basic freedoms of life that we just take for granted in our country.
And I'd say, Ken, you probably underestimate the effect, because each one of those 2,500 employees has their own circle and the own group that they have energized, et cetera. So it has a multiplier effect from that standpoint.
Well, there's no doubt, because over the years, 30 years of doing this, the tree lays seeds. So if I look across the greater Chicagoland community, a number of the most successful financial services firms are ex-Citadel colleagues. A number of the most successful tech startups are ex-Citadel colleagues. I've had colleagues take the ideas that we've developed to apply to financial markets to apply, for example, to insulin treatment or insulin delivery for people with diabetes. So I've seen the impact that strong firms have on their community. And within Chicago, my colleagues, I, and people that used to work at Citadel, we now probably account for 2% of the tax base of our state. That means real money that goes towards the social programs that do impact people's lives in a meaningful way. The K through 12 education, albeit broken in Illinois, we help to fund and make that possible.
Not the decay, but attempting to lift it up.
You have no idea how important that is to my partners and myself.
I think the market, since you got in it, has changed dramatically. When I look at the type of inventories we carried even 40 years ago, they're substantially larger than inventories carried in the street today. Liquidity, quality, resilience of liquidity. How do you see financial markets today with many of the restrictions causing the intermediaries not to carry inventory? And I'm sure you've built parts of your business to adjust to that. How do you see liquidity today?
One of the great success stories within Citadel is Citadel Securities, which is the largest market maker in the U.S. equities market, in fact, most equity markets around the world, and the U.S. options markets. We carry an inventory on any given night of roughly $30 to $50 billion of assets. And so this idea that the private sector is not committing capital to provide liquidity to our financial markets is really an idea pushed by the banking system that wants to have some of the restrictions of the Volcker Rule released from their activity. I personally believe that our large investment banks, our Goldman's, Sachs's, our Morgan Stanley's, should not be part of the banking system. That this is activity that fundamentally belongs in the private sector without the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and that a market that looked like the market that existed when you were running Drexel's high-yield business, which was phenomenally successful and important, is unleashed from both the shackles of government and then from the implicit subsidies with government. So the liquidity story, just in big bold print, I think is a bit of a myth. It's never been cheaper to trade equities than it is today in the United States. It's never been cheaper to trade options than it is today in the United States. It's never been cheaper to trade interest rate swaps, to trade government bonds. It's hard to find an asset class where the cost of doing business has gone up in the last 10 years.
So, Ken, I think you've put forth some interesting ideas here that I want to just push on a little more. Do you believe there's enormous liquidity? All we have to do is look at Japan with 17 trillion deposited at minus, or look at Germany with billions of dollars and trillions of dollars as minus, or the liquidity that exists today. And with these low level of interest rates, which appear to be with us for quite a while, do you believe the financial markets today are in a position that the government can withdraw from their lending in real estate and home mortgage, and we could securitize these again in the marketplace and let the market invest in these securities. Obviously, your other suggestion here is Citadel is not guaranteed by the U.S. government. The taxpayer's not at risk in any way. And so effectively, we can reduce risk at a federal level. If we look just at the example of Ireland, a country that was economically very successful, their problems were their three banks were as big as the entire GDP. And when they got in trouble, the country was in trouble. So is this the time to reduce the involvement of the government in financial markets?
There's two concepts I think we're intertwining here, and one of these concepts actually goes back to the game-changing work that you did at Drexel, which was to expand the U.S. capital markets to be a source of capital to corporate America in the loan and bond markets. So today, corporate America borrows about 80% of its money from the private sector and not from the banking system. In Europe, it's almost exactly the opposite. It's roughly 80% of all borrowings come from the banking system. I think this is one of the key drivers of economic growth post-08 was the resiliency of the U.S. capital markets and the ability for the U.S. capital markets to quickly resolve issues in firms that were in distress and to quickly provide capital to firms that were in a position to profitably grow. In contrast, the European banks, which have been burdened by bad loans and still are, have been much slower to extend credit to growth opportunities in Europe. And it's amazing how important and impactful this is. I mean, just take a step back. You can immediately name 5 or 6 great U.S. tech firms started in the last 10 years, just in the blink of an eye. Name one out of Europe.
Well, unless they've got funding from the Vision Fund and SoftBank, they probably haven't gotten to grow as fast. I think the other point is that you've made here, I keep pointing out the importance of the 1970s, this period from 73 to 74, where really the banks had serious financial problems and the public and private markets grew. And really these problems in the 80s, we had serious problems in the 80s also with the oil going from 40 to 10, not from 40 to 100, and devastating real estate, Colorado, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, etc. But the U.S. economy grew even though the banking system shrunk. Why has Citadel or others in the financial community not stepped in to change Europe faster? If we have 80% owned not by the banks in the United States and 80% owned by Europe, it would seem in the banks, it would seem to be an enormous opportunity for Citadel or other financial institutions to step in and play a role.
The European banks have expansive balance sheets. They are very focused on maintaining the status quo. They're not interested in the disintermediation that goes with the opening of the capital markets. They are not aligned with the investment community in releasing that asset class to a broader investor base. That's a really big issue in Europe. The second issue in Europe is you tend to have governments that want to maintain this status quo because the banking system is therefore in a position to protect their national champions. So it becomes a means for governments to, in indirect and direct ways, support some of their incumbent large national champions that would face a different set of costs and opportunities if they relied more on the public funding markets.
It's interesting, Ken, between 76 and 86, I had spent considerable time in Japan trying to convince them that they would rue the day if they didn't liquefy and have public or private markets. And 100% what you said, they didn't want markets to grow up, and they wanted independent of the existing financial institutions, and it was only a couple years later that we had the crisis occur in 89, 90 in Japan. Let me take it from a different approach. When I first went to Wall Street in '68 or '9, I was surprised that the utility curve of a CEO didn't necessarily overlap the utility curve of the owners of the company. Quite often you got paid more the bigger you got, not how whether you made money or not. But we've had a dramatic change here over the decades. And today there's more private firms controlled by just large private equity than public. The Wilshire 5000 has gone from 7,500 to 3,500 or 3,600 today. As you look at the IPO market today and what's occurring in the market, do you see a dramatic change from when you went into the business of a desire to be a public company versus a private company? How does it affect your investing, market making, et cetera?
So there is no doubt that the increased amount of capital available to growth firms has dramatically reduced the incentives to go public. It used to be that your Genentechs would access the public markets the first chance they got, because that opened a huge amount of capital for them to pursue their corporate vision and their mission. But today, the depth of capital available across the venture capital community and the private equity community allows companies to reach a much greater scale before it becomes apparent they should turn to the public markets for capital. The downside of this, of course, is that for the average American, there's fewer growth stocks to invest in. And that's an unfortunate consequence of this transformation of where capital comes from. One of the drivers of this is, of course, the increased government regulation and burdens that have been placed on public companies post-Enron. And Enron was a disgrace to our capital markets. It was a disgrace to the word integrity and accounting standards. I'm not trying to in any way repaint history. Enron was a disgrace. But here, the regulatory pendulum swung so far with Sarbanes-Oxley that we really diminished the incentives for companies to go public or to remain public in a profound way. And this was well written at the time. This is not a 20 years later, this has dawned on us as a potential consequence. But at the very time that we instituted Sarbanes-Oxley, there was a very loud and vocal community that said this will transform the way our public markets work, and not for the better. And I believe that to be true to this day.
So let's take Citadel. A number of other financial firms have gone public: KKR, Apollo, Carlyle, Blackstone, etc. Do you envision Citadel to ever be a public company?
This is not a trick question. and I'm pausing because I have to grapple with two realities. I already have several hundred bosses. Those are the people I manage money for. And they're not shy to tell me how they think I'm performing. And then I've got a group of extraordinarily talented partners that I work with who are never shy to tell me how they feel I'm running the business. So I already feel like I have a lot of bosses. And yet going public would create yet another significant voice in my day-to-day life that would tell me how to both run the business and allocate our capital. We're reaching the point where that probably becomes the right thing to do, just given the scale of our business. But I have to tell you, like so many private equity-funded businesses, I really enjoy the flexibility that goes with being privately held. I think it's a huge competitive asset for us to be able to make decisions quickly, to be able to make mistakes and acknowledge and deal with it quickly. If we go down the wrong path, we can exit that decision in the blink of an eye. If you're a public company, the board's going to talk about, well, we committed all these resources and how are you going to change course? We just change course. And that allows us to be much more successful in the long run, because every successful firm goes down a number of dead ends. I've had more than my fair share. What's driven our success, and this is part of what drives America's success, it's okay in our country to fail. But you got to stand back up on your feet, and you got to pick a new path to go down, and you got to go down that path.
Let's, I mentioned this story to you once, Ken. It was, I believe, 1988, and I'm in the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. with Dr. Hammer, Gorbachev, and their commissioner of commerce. I'm not exactly sure what the title is, and they wanted to go into venture capital. First, they saw Avion, and they wanted maybe go in the water business with all the frozen water in Siberia, but this was shortly after Chernobyl, and I was polite, and I told them, I just don't think the world is ready right now for water. Two, we're now talking about their
Is that glow-in-the-dark brand?
Yeah. Well, that was my idea, but I wanted to be more polite. And I think the second thing really struck me on what you just said. So they were experts in physics and science and chemistry and biology and all these fields. And so then they want to go into venture capital. And I'm listening to it for a while, and then I told them, if you go in this field, are you aware that maybe 7 out of 10 won't make it? And I would say there was not a millisecond delay. And the commissar told me, that's okay, we'll just put him in jail. And so I think when you look at these issues, I think people greatly underestimate the chance to fail. I know when I hired people, a group, I remember in '72 I was interviewing, and I was concerned about hiring no one that ever made a mistake, because all that meant is they make a bigger mistake on my watch from that standpoint. I think one of the things that's really differentiated you from others in the financial service industry, Ken, is the willingness to make tough decisions. If you have 10 private equity leaders here and ask them what is the biggest mistake they have made over the years, it was not changing management fast enough. And I think one of the things that you have done probably better than anyone is be decisive. Decisive in going into a business, but decisive in changing management or going out if it was a wrong idea. What do you attribute that to? Why are you so much better at making those decisions than others have been?
I think there's two things that are really important to, there's actually three that are really important to understand in that question. The first is, when I started Citadel when I was 20 years old. And we, within months of launch, were trading 24 hours a day. So we trade in the US, we trade in Japan, Hong Kong, much of Europe, back to the United States. So I had to learn to delegate at an incredibly early point in my career. And I think that was really one of the greatest life lessons I had, was to learn to trust in others.
Wait a minute, are you telling us you couldn't stay up 24 hours a day?
No, I couldn't. I would do about 2/3 of the US, and I would do about 2/3 of Japan. And that left the opening of the US for somebody else. You and I are like, you're the morning guy, I'm the night owl. But I couldn't. I had to have colleagues that I could trust to make really good decisions. But of course, in that world, you also see people who make poor decisions. And when you're a startup and every decision matters, somebody who consistently makes poor decisions puts everyone's jobs at risk. And I have great colleagues from out of college to lateral hires up and down the team. If I've got the wrong manager, they're putting everyone's job at risk. And I'm going to put the interests of the greater good in front of trying to save a manager who just can't make good judgment calls. And that has served us well over the years. We get a bit of grief about this in the press. They love to write about the fact that we're willing to make changes. And all I will say is the average hedge fund lives about 3 years. And we're on our 30th anniversary in just several months. So it's worked for us. The other dimension that goes with this is if you have a team that's willing to embrace change, you're willing to go outside the box and thinking about the kinds of people you're bringing to your organization. And so if I look across our team, we have people with backgrounds from all over the map, from physics to engineering, people who've worked in mainstream corporate America far away from finance, to people who've worked on Wall Street. And that incredibly inclusive environment is very powerful in the rate of innovation that happens within our four walls. This is not a firm of everyone comes from the same background, the same history. It's a firm of really diverse backgrounds, and that just accelerates the rate of innovation.
So let's stay with that concept, emerging science, technology. What do you see as the role of AI in your business going forward? How are you preparing for it? And how will Citadel be different 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, I think we're not preparing for it. We're using it. We've been using the state-of-the-art machine learning techniques for several years now, and it makes a difference in our business. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, and it's going to make a difference in every business that has significant amounts of data. So one of the misconceptions about AI is it'll solve all problems. It won't. But it is very powerful in solving problems where you have vast amounts of data and you're looking for patterns or you're looking for causality. So we'll see it in, for example, radiological exams. You'll see AI augment the doctor in reading the radiological results. We'll see it in cancer treatment. You're already seeing some very successful businesses being formed around here's the genome of the cancer, and here are successful therapies in treating this cancer. So where you have large data sets, you will see a real impact from AI. I think the popular press overstates the impact AI will have in society, but in certain fields, it will be profoundly game-changing.
Let's talk about American competitiveness. And I know this is an area that you feel very strongly, have spoken about for decades. Where do you see it coming from? How do you see it protecting this competitiveness? We've looked at a number of issues, and we have a number of sessions at the Global Conference here in 2019 focused on productivity, increasing productivity, American competitiveness in the world.
So let's talk about the history of our country. By and large, our country comes from a heritage of people who came here for opportunity. They left the comfort of Europe, they left the comfort of somewhere else in the world, their family, their friends, their relationships. They came here for an opportunity. So we have, in some sense, in our gene pool, both cultural and genetic, a country of people who are striving. I couldn't find a better slide. This wasn't mine, but thank you, Michael. They really have. They've come here for this. Now, to keep the American dream alive, we need to make sure that opportunity continues from generation to generation. And the greatest threat to American competitiveness is today, the zip code you grow up in determines the school you go to. And in so many zip codes where our schools are clearly failing our students, and the body politic is unwilling to change management of those schools, leadership of those school systems, we're letting our youth down in a way that is just existentially inexcusable.
And I know you've attempted to do a number of things, and I know in an area that we've been active in, many years ago you were focused on early child care education, where you have the highest return on your money, and the challenges that we've had. And many of those challenges can be related to the emancipation of women, where for decades they really educated America. And America was the first country really in the world, beginning in 1870, to decide we're going to educate all citizens. But if you were a woman for almost 100 years, your opportunities were to be a teacher, librarian, nurse. And as we emancipated women in the 70s, we didn't really effectively think we had to restaff and how we're going to achieve that. What did your analysis on early child care education show you?
So, well, I'm going to step back to 100,000 feet as I answer this question. You know, in business, there's this concept of the knowing-doing gap. Do you know what you need to do? And then the real gap, in my mind, is not the knowing-doing gap. It's the doing gap. In education, we know what we need to do. There are no secrets about what we need to do to fix American schools. There is simply a will to make those changes. So, for example, in the inner cities, you need a longer school year. What we found with our child education work is that students during the summertime, coming from families that do not have a richness, you ready for this? Books on shelf at home. One of your most important correlated variables to childhood learning. So if you have a child that goes home to a book that is literally, a house devoid of books, devoid of interaction with their parents, the dimension of learning, because both parents are working, they're struggling to make a living, they really struggle at the start of the next school year. They lose a huge part of what they learned in just those 3 months. So for the inner city, it's a longer school year, it's a longer school day. If I was at SEO last night in New York, which celebrated its annual fundraiser, they've had tremendous success with kids from challenging communities in New York. Those kids go to school on Saturdays. They go to school over the summer, and they absolutely knock the ball out of the park when it comes to going on to college. So we know what we need to do, but we just got to do it.
So Ken, let's talk about theory for a couple of minutes. When I first went to Wall Street, it was random walk, that the markets were perfect. Tech and charting was the theory of the day. Today we hear a lot about modern monetary theory. So it's a different theory than when I first went there. That didn't make any sense in the theories I was hearing. Today we have modern monetary theory. Why don't you define it as you see it and maybe think about it as an issue?
Well, the modern MMT came to the forefront of dialogue in the same way that the New Green Deal did, so courtesy of AOC. And the idea that government borrowings are effectively unconstrained is just preposterous. We live in a world of fiat currency. Our entire economy is rooted in the belief that a dollar has value. And modern MMT says that people will maintain that belief in the value of the currency even as the government explicitly prints money. And all that comes to my mind is the hyperinflation of Germany. Because the underpinning of MMT is that when times are challenging such that inflation is accelerating, ready for this? Governments will make the hard decisions to cut spending and increase taxes. And our track record in that area, we know that track record. We know it around the world. And so the minute that governments back away from discipline in managing inflation rates, in a world of fiat currency, we will quickly end up in hyperinflation and the collapse of our economy as we know it. I think this is a theory best left in the back room with little virtue to be had.
So Ken, you were 20 years old when you founded Citadel. I was, I think, 19 years old in 1965 when I switched to analyze credit and create convertible securities, preferreds, and everything as a way of how do you finance a company. There are other Ken Griffins out there. They might be anywhere in the world today. What is your message to those individuals as you look back over the last 30 plus years? What are the things you learned that you would tell them along that road?
So I think it's important to recognize that each of us in our own way are unquestionably an inspiration and resource for the generation to come. I Like, if there was the Michael Milken fan club, back when I was in college, I was member number 1. And you may or may not know this, you put out a poster of all the financial instruments that Drexel was involved with or created. That hangs in my conference room. And I just admire the innovation that your team and you brought to the table at Drexel throughout your career there. It changed the entire fabric of the U.S. financial markets in a profoundly powerful way for entrepreneurs. It's amazing what you did. And yet, I can't emphasize enough how much your colleagues would invest time with me. Like, for example, the person who was one of your top convertible sales or traders was JT, and JT would spend time with me on the phone walking through how a bond was priced, how to think about analyzing its value. So one of the great things about our country is the willingness of each generation to both be an inspiration and a resource to the next. That really is a unique part of the American story. You know, just this last week, I was with a young man from Colorado who grew up in a very rural area, middle-class family. He's waitlisted at one of the best universities in the United States. His mother was friends with one of my former coworkers, and I'm coaching him for his college interview. All right, that's an American story. And I really do hope that those of us, and I know you do this every day in what you do, those of us who've been so fortunate to be the beneficiaries of so much that our country has to offer, that we just continue to give back to the next generation that follows us.
So Ken, you have made one of the 2 or 3 largest contributions to higher ed, to supporting scholarships, to supporting universities, etc. What do you see as the reason for that decision you've made that we could share with others who have the capability? And how do you think it will change either those universities or the life of the people that go to those universities?
So the Office of Financial Aid at Harvard is the Griffin Office of Financial Aid, and I have several hundred students at Harvard who have scholarships that I've underwritten in the context of a almost $700 million capital campaign that we did in the area at Harvard for financial aid. So Harvard did a $6 billion capital campaign. We raised $700 million to help young adults from all over the world attend what I believe is one of the greatest universities in the world. And why? Because just a few weeks ago, I was back in Boston, and I was with one of the students who has recently left Harvard. He's back in Africa where he grew up, working on privatizing hospitals, rolling them up, and providing better health care at a lower price to people across the continent. And he's in his 20s. So I hope that the work that I do at Harvard brings the future leaders of the world from around the world to this great university. And in that environment and in that ethos, we create young men and young women like this man who's gone off in his 20s to change healthcare across the continent. To me, that is the most rewarding way that I can use the capital that I've been fortunate enough to accumulate, is to help that next generation stand tall on its feet and change the world just as you and I hope to do in our careers.
Ken, I hope you have a long, healthy life and have a chance to mentor thousands of those, because what happens really in Africa will determine the future of this planet, with most of the world's population growing there. And we're going to have, when we go, keep an eye on your young student in Africa. So I want to thank you for being you and your contributions. It was a pleasure to visit with you today.
Thank you, Mike.